think you're there. I can't really see you. I did see my landscape map yesterday when Ian put it up on the board, and it was a moment of not quite terror, but certainly apprehension, because it's amazing what people can do when they grab your work and run with it. They go to places that you'd be afraid to go yourself. So that's not the first time I've experienced that. So hang on. Yeah, I've got you. He's avoiding tea. We can joke about that tomorrow. Anyway, what I want to do today is to explain how I developed it and why I'm cautious. So that's the intent. I'll probably start with the opportunity, and that's what SPIVS is about. This all began when the Murray-Darling Basin Commission had a bold dream to interest finance companies in buying land and putting trees on it so they could control salinity. And these were going to be called special purpose investment vehicles. Yeah, they hadn't noticed it, but I did. We got involved in a project looking at the economic and social feasibility of this, and land values were the key problem. It just didn't make any sense. So that's a report that never actually got published. We're asked to just, if they're interesting, and just leave it as it is. But I was left with some data on land values, so I did what every good researcher does and ignore what they should be doing and followed my curiosity, and ended up with that map of the relationship between land values per hectare and production value per hectare. And considering I came from a peach orchard on the outskirts of Melbourne, where farming was eventually forced out by high land prices, that resonated with me, resonated quite deeply. So I followed my curiosity and developed a narrative. Now I know you can't read that, but I'm just going to tell you the narrative, the story that sort of came first before there were any numbers. It's quite simple. Financial pressure for farm expansion on all farms that want to remain viable, but they have to purchase land to increase their productivity. So in the end, they drive out their neighbours, except where others come in to buy the land for reasons other than farming, put up the price of land such that the farming industry can't keep up and is eventually forced out. That's the simple narrative. There's a fair bit more detail on the paper on that narrative. What I did is I took that narrative eventually and pulled 12 or 13 indicators, spatial indicators out of it. Thought, now what can I do with these? And once again, following curiosity, there was no project for this. If you know DPI, you know that all work's meant to be in projects. So this is a homage to curiosity and serendipity. What came out was a principal components analysis that I played with, and on the initial variables I chose, 60% of the variance could be explained in one factor out of those 12 or so variables. I've since made it a bit more complex. You never get your initial magic number. It's now down to about 30%. For those of you who have played with principal components analysis, if you're in social research, you know that if you get 30 to 40% in the first factor, that's pretty good. So here we go. This first factor became my first landscape. I call the factor now the amenity factor. Areas of the landscape that score high on this factor, they've got few farmers in the workforce relative to the rest of the population. There's lots of small farms measured in area. There's lots of people coming in from outside purchasing land. So there's in-migration to the local towns as well as to the farms. Population's increasing. There's lots of off-farm income. There are balanced gender ratios, so you can take the obverse that there are unbalanced gender ratios elsewhere. Housing's relatively expensive. Land values are high, and farmers produce a small amount of income. That's what the map of it looks like, the current version. Of course, that's a bit too complex, so being a social scientist working in policy, you realise you have to make things simple. It's going to travel, so cut it down to a few smaller number of categories, ended up with that. You can see that the areas away from Melbourne are light, it's low on this factor, and the areas closer to Melbourne, darker, are high on this factor. And those of you that have been observing this story develop over the past 5 years will recognise it's very similar to that. In fact, the first version of the landscapes that I made was essentially dividing the factor scores from that into 3. And they became the production zone that scored low on the amenity factor. That's the pink. The blue, which is the narrative advanced a little from there. But my message today is there's more than one map, and I'm not sure how many landscapes there are. The curious thing about all this was that there was a second factor in there that accounted for about 20 to 25% of the variance, depending on what you did, what factors, what variables you included. And I've since labelled that the intensification factor. This is orthogonal to the amenity factor. It's not related statistically. Areas that score high on this have younger farmers. The people that leave farming are younger. Farms are getting larger financially. And the farms there tend to be on average large in financial terms. Now, in both cases I've measured size there financially, not in terms of area, and that becomes quite important. Look at the map. The dark areas score high on this factor. Irrigation areas along the river, some of the dairy areas along the coast, but particularly the highest scores on the eastern outskirts of Melbourne, the Yarra Valley, Cranbourne, or to the west, Werribee. Areas that have got horticulture, intensive animal industries, highly concentrated activity on small areas of land. Simplifying, it looks like that. So I'm left with a problem then. I've got two factors now. I really have to explain this second factor, but I can't just do a simple subdivision of one factor to create my landscapes. Where do I go from there? Okay, do a scattergram. I can find no obvious clustering there, except for one or two little centres. There's a hole in the middle, which makes it even more interesting. It's almost a donut. Okay, so let's just be arbitrary. Let's just do a simple 2x2 cross classification and subdivide it like that, and I get this, which bears some resemblance to the initial landscape map that many of you have seen, but the blue or the green and the purple or dark blue are all intermixed. There's got to be another approach, okay? No-brainer approach, just put it into K-means clustering algorithm, and I get something that looks like a different version of my landscape map, 3 variants of the first factor, scoring low, medium and high. Not much use to me, so there I embark on hierarchical cluster analysis. You can tell that I love doing this sort of stuff, weighting in numbers. It's a lot of fun. It's looking for patterns. Now, hierarchical cluster analysis takes all your cases, looks for the two that are closest, joins them together to create a new element, and then does the whole process again. And gradually you get a tree that builds up from all your individual, in this case, statistical local areas up into one. And wherever you decide to stop the process, you can have 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 clusters. I'm just going to take you through what it looks like for one of these analyses. That's starting off with the 3 cluster solution. Okay, let's step back once. Well, before I do that, you've basically got high amenity around Melbourne and a combination of what was my original transition and amenity areas, and then you've got the production area, which is relatively unchanged. Okay, what splits up? There. The areas tend to be where there's intensive agriculture, so they've become the 4th cluster. Split it up again. Okay, we're starting to get a split between transition and amenity. Split it again. Birchip. We've all known Birchip's different. And there's 7. You keep going 8. It's starting to get a bit too complex to explain to people in policy now, so I'll probably have to go back. But lest you think that this is a solution, change the method of clustering just a little, and we'll get something different. Here's 3. It looks somewhat similar to the previous one, except the production zone has now absorbed the transition area from my original conceptualisation. Birchip again, we just know they're different. Okay, high amenity to the north of Melbourne appearing. Transition area starts to appear. We've got 6, 7. Highly intensive areas in the outskirts of Melbourne drop out. 8. Some more highly intensive areas. Now, I'm looking for patterns when I'm doing this. I'm not looking for the answer. It's a bit like theology. You're sort of searching for meaning in the midst of a lot of confusion. But taking just these 2, I can see that the 6 cluster solution and the 5 cluster solution from the different options give reasonably similar sort of overall patterns. The boundaries aren't exactly the same, but I can see a production area in there. I can see a transition zone. I can see an amenity zone. And I can see 2 areas around Melbourne. One which is scores really highly on the amenity zone, and the other which scores highly on the intensive area. Okay, trouble with doing this cluster analysis is it's not really repeatable. So I go into a 3x3 Cartesian space. I basically say what's high, medium, and low on each factor, and subdivide it. That's how it works out. Basically, the areas, most of the statistical local areas end up in the coloured area. So they're low amenity and medium intensification, or they're medium amenity and medium intensification, or they're high amenity with low, medium, or high intensification. That's still too many. If I just say that there are 5 there, I'm still not totally happy with that. So what I did was I mapped them, and I come up with something that has some similarities with the previous hierarchical cluster analysis. So I'm still pattern exploring, but I just create a simple rule like this, joining them like that. So the transition area is the yellow, the blue is the amenity area, the production area is the brown, and there's a new area, the pink one, which I've called intensive agriculture, which is high on amenity and high on intensification. Map them, and this is my latest version of the landscapes. Now you can see that the changes to the east of Melbourne and a few other areas. There's a new landscape called intensive agriculture, and the story's relatively little changed. I'll just run through the story for those of you who haven't seen it. Looking at the production area there, it's characterised by flatness, boringness, I suppose you'd say if you're not into farming and profit from farming. Big machinery. Abandoned houses, which not all houses are abandoned, but the point being that the demand for housing gradually increases as population declines, and eventually houses are abandoned and nothing replaces them because there's no demand for that land to be developed, unlike Bob's example where he doesn't allow de-intensification of dwelling density. Here it happens. Reduced services. That's in the Hanna railway station. I couldn't resist that one. But yeah, reduction in the level of service. I think that encapsulates it. You can still have a bog, but you're certainly not going to have privacy. Some could say that's the way we deliver settling services in some rural areas now. Yeah, that's more of the same. But also, this area is it's a testing ground for new service delivery innovations. So it's no question. This is the area that the Bendigo Bank model came from. The rural transaction centre it's developed in this area. It's looking for new models to deliver because the old models haven't necessarily been working. At the other end, the normal amenity zone with the intensive areas dropped out. Lots of beef cattle because it's easy to manage. You can work in another job and do that. It tends to be associated with water and hills and more rainfall. Houses on hills, not always tasteful. That's just down the road from here, actually. Anyone own it? I haven't made the enemies good. I think this person must have migrated from Dubrovnik. This is just down the road opposite that. It's subdivision. Not necessarily subdivision that follows any plans, but it happens sometimes. And what's sold here, I put this up because what's sold often in these areas is a dream. And the dream there, top left, is green grass. And the reality is bottom right. That's looking the other direction from the sign. Empty dam. This actually would have a bit of water in it now. It would be green, but it certainly hasn't been green for a long time. Dreaming about farming often. That's the Tuscan olive dream. It's still going strong. The farming that does survive tends to be more intensive. It's dependent on water or it's dependent on tourists. Then in between the transition zone tend to be the existing industries are often having a hard time. We've got the wool industry here. The number of sheep is halved in the last 15 years. The Australian bull flock, which is a spectacular decline by my book. And often that means that the industry is gradually contracting, leaving space for other things to move in. In this case, the Western District, two examples being for example, Timber Corp moving in with its plantations, and others, say wind farms. Both of these are controversial, but for entirely different reasons. The Timber Corp type development is controversial because it displaces, willingly, but it displaces part of the farm community, and those who remain are often distressed by this. The other makes it possible for the existing farm community to stay, despite lowering income from their wool flock, but it displeases others. So they're controversial for entirely different reasons. And basically what this is about is that conflict's almost inevitable in this area. New people coming into the bush and into towns, new cultures, old cultures, making the mix is sometimes a challenge. Sometimes it can lead to a regeneration of something totally different, which is the story of what happened to Malden. Malden's now firmly in the amenity area, but 20 years ago people were moving there because housing was cheap. And they transferred the culture of the town, and that brought others in and put the price of housing up now. I can't afford to live there. My mates that took the cheap option to move there, they're worth more than I am now. I followed the traditional career and bought a house in Bendigo. Not really as good an investment. Last one of these is the intensive area around Melbourne and some other locations. I'm still working on this, what it means, but basically most agriculture you see isn't really agriculture, it's grazing, it's organic lawnmowers, it's beef cattle, but interspersed amongst it will be highly intensive businesses. The more pleasant of them are, for example, like the vineyards in the Yarra Valley, but there's a lot less romance in growing vegetables. Believe me, I grew up on a horticultural block. I think there's no romance. And this sort of stuff, nobody wants it. But if you want to look at the highest value industry in agriculture around Melbourne, and the greatest employment contribution from agriculture is this sort of stuff. Mushrooms, broilers, intensive animals. That's the stuff that nobody actually wants near. So where do I go from here? I mean, the point I'm making going through all this is to say that I'm still exploring and trying to understand what's going on. I don't claim to have the final answer, and I'm happy for others to run with it, but I'm still exploring. I've got a few problems. One is out-of-date data. Another one, how many landscapes? What to do about edges? What the problem with resolution of data? Can I extend it to Australia? I think so. How do I deal with time? And the book. Let's go through that. Okay, why is it out of date? Most of the data is from 2001. This is Victorian rural land prices from 1988 to 2006. My analysis ends where that graph kinks up. Part of the problem, or the solution, or the reason for this, and increasingly being even greater influence, is the massive growth in super funds. Super funds are now buying into serious agriculture in a way that they haven't in the past, and that's going to transform my analysis, make some of my analysis out of date very quickly. Water trade, massive changes are occurring. This is just my attempt to try and encapsulate one particular year of trade in the northern irrigation area of Victoria. That's transforming some landscapes. It wasn't even in my initial analysis. Which leads to the next question, how many landscapes? At this stage I think I'm actually going to go for 6, maybe 5, but they're nested, so you could stick with 3, but they're production, amenity, small farm, high amenity, dormitory. And I've come to that conclusion after listening to the arguments from John Holmes at the University of Queensland, or Emeritus at the University of Queensland, who's done a similar sort of analysis, quite separate from me from first principles, and he's come up with this division. And I found it quite interesting that I initially rejected it, and then it appears in my cluster analysis, suggesting that I have to keep an open mind. Then there's transition, intensive, peri-urban, and I'm still thinking about whether I need to make irrigation a special case because it just moves so quickly there. Edges, that's easily solved, just crunch them out. That solves the problem that when I turn up and talk to a farmer group, someone says, I'm on the edge of that SLA and we're not that landscape, we're different. I have to say, yeah, you probably are. Well, why doesn't the map say it? Good point. They can't argue as easily with this one once they get to the boundaries. Data resolution. I have data, I've used data at statistical local area level, which is not very fine. But I have some data down to parish, some to collective district, maybe even something will come out of the mesh blocks, although I doubt it, I think because of constraints of confidentiality. But I'm working on a way of getting finer resolution in the analysis so that I'm not limited to the boundaries of statistical local areas. Yes, I have been extending it to Australia, that's Western Australia, but I'm not publishing it because it's giving some funny results. I'm still trying to work out why Cobar is intensive agriculture. I think there's a glitch in the data and haven't got to it. More serious, how do I monitor change, given that change is happening? I think the most value out of this analysis is to be able to map the shift in the boundaries between the landscapes. And certainly, I can have some attempt at it for the shifting of the production zone using just one indicator here. This is comparing 1961 with 2001. It's not an exact analogue of my production zone, but using a particular rule just for this process, because that's the data I was limited to on this, it shows a dramatic shift in the boundary. That's still happening. I have to come to some firm rules, decision rules, on how to allocate to my different landscapes, so I can then apply those rules temporally. And finally, yes, there's a book about it, but it's in peer review, and I'm not quite sure of the publication strategy. I think there's going to be a bit of a battle on that. If you want to read more, that's where to go. Thanks very much.
Any questions for Nick?
That's basically no data, because a lot of my indicators are dependent on having farmers in there, and I have a decision rule, or a number of decision rules depending on how game I am as to how few farmers I'll accept, and I've never passed that rule with yarrow ranges. Does that make sense to you? I mean, there might be a couple in there, but there's certainly not many in the ABS counts. Yeah, well, it just drops out. I don't give it much attention. It just drops out because if I'm missing one score when I do the initial principal components analysis, it just drops out as missing data. I mean, there are some indicators there, and I have used a subsuite of indicators to do the Australian map. Just regressed the factor scores to the factor scores using the subsuite of indicators. And I probably could do that, but I've been lazy so far because I'm still exploring essentially. That's probably why I'm doing all this exploration at the moment. I agree there entirely. That's the most valuable message, potentially. Ian's use of it yesterday was that sort of, he was looking at those sorts of trends in a way. And I can see methods of doing it, regressing to subsets of factor scores. That's why I want to get more resolution. Because if you've got better resolution, you can actually track the trends more effectively. But I'm not there yet, because I haven't really decided on my decision rules. I've got to decide on how many landscapes I want, then decide on the decision rules to create them. We'll get there.
I often get asked by other researchers, can you give us a copy of the landscape map so we can work out what landscape we're dealing with in this particular project? How do we get people to move beyond the maps and think about what you've obviously been thinking about, which is the principles and the processes behind the maps?
Yeah, I get that. He's cheating. He knows I get that phone call regularly, as well as Roger getting it. The first thing I have to do is ask why someone wants the map. And I'm being presumptuous in there that I'm seeking to make a judgment as to how dangerous or otherwise it is to use the map for that purpose. But in the end, I give something often because I'm interested to see what people do with it. But maybe I should be more cautious sometimes, because I have no faith in where the boundary actually fits as it lies, as I've shown. I'm more interested in the story behind it. But yeah, I'm going to have to commit myself.
Thank you very much, Neil.